Stanford University.
So thanks for the introduction. When I was told that I would be giving a talk today, I envisioned a room with about 15 people in it. So I wasn't sure if I should wear shorts and flip-flops. So what I'm going to be talking about today is some of Valerio's work, what his group does, also some of what I do. Basically, integrated analysis and visualization for data-intensive science. So basically, in this model, we're given a lot of data by scientists, and they want to visualize it and find out what's in there. So we get data from a lot of different sources. Of course, there's the massive simulations. Just the pointer? Massive simulations. We have microscopy imaging, satellite imaging, climate modeling, photography. Take your pick. Basically, you have large image data. You want to manage this data, visualize it, analyze it, all without waiting years to do it. So traditional methods are often ineffective, basically because you don't have enough memory on your machine. You don't want to wait for your data to download off the server. And massive models are challenging. A lot of information. It's very complex. There's for example, in this Rayleigh-Taylor instability, you have the problem of multiple scales, so orders of magnitudes of scales almost, where maybe the scientist is actually interested in counting sort of the number of these protrusions and building a model based on that. When looking at the data, all you see are these little swirls everywhere. So how do you deal with that? So we were recently awarded a center for extreme data management, analytics, and visualization, and to take an approach which really takes in all the different aspects of this process of how do you store the data, how do you write algorithms that can interact with the way you've stored the data, and also how do you develop abstractions so that you can ask interesting questions about your data. So we have some interesting storage techniques. Typically, scientific data is available as big blocks of data. If you run a simulation, even if it's AMR, at some point it's going to be blocked. And we have this hierarchical Z order, which turns out to be very useful in that it's cache oblivious and can be streamed very nicely. However, if you start using advanced data formats, you have to modify your algorithms so that they can handle these kinds of formats. So they should handle streaming, progressive, multi-resolution, also out-of-core computations. And one of our design goals is to have scalability across a bunch of platforms. So in addition to running on your large GPU clusters, you want it to run on your laptop and maybe even your iPod when people still used iPods. Now we have iPhone plugins, but. So the data management pipeline is redesigned. So as a proof of concept, we take some core techniques and show how they can be mapped onto this redesigned pipeline. So again, we're going to do some cache oblivious out-of-core processing and use progressive algorithms to do our standard things like visualization. And this is to enable things like remote data streaming. So software infrastructure really has to take into account the data layout, the algorithm design, and also the processing network so that an application should be able to run interactively in a happy way. So here's an example of course-defined processing, streaming processing algorithm for image segmentation. And you can actually classify algorithms based on how they interact with the data. So you have your standard data access, which is accesses in bricks and slices, or you can start streaming it, or guided streaming, or all the way down to adaptive progressive streaming. And on the other side of that is the way you access your data on the hardware, where ideally you want this cache-oblivious raw data access, so that it removes the memory hierarchy from the user's attention. So what we look at in particular, what's of particular interest for us is top-down algorithms. So if what you can do is stream the data and get the coarse resolution first, then you want to do kind of the opposite of decimation, where you start with the fine resolution data and you build coarser and coarser models. For example, if you build a MIP map in OpenGL, it starts with the fine stuff, does some interpolation to make you a smaller, or just selection to make you a smaller texture, all the way up to the coarse level. And of course, your speed as you access coarser levels of your representation is going to be faster, but you lose accuracy. What we really want in our approach is progressive refinement, where you start from the coarse level, you start refining that, and for various reasons, because you can't account for any errors you did while decimating, the accuracy is going to be lower. So we really want to approaches that minimize that error. However, there's a huge benefit, which is that if you go from coarse to fine, you can start streaming your operations, which is if my algorithm also works coarse to fine, then while the first stage of the algorithm's working, it starts streaming its output, and so on, and you have a streaming pipeline where nobody's waiting for anything, which is a very nice scenario. And we've implemented this in the VISIS framework. This is a framework that does the data management and streaming, and a neat thing is you can run this same piece of code on a display wall as your iPhone to interact with very, very large data sets. If you want, you can visit the SKI website. So this is on the University of Utah. I realize you can't read that, but basically you can play around with large data sets on the web. And just as a proof of concept here, I'm going to look at this. So here, I'm running this over the wireless, and let's say I want to render a, my viewer is old, okay, we'll ignore that. Here's a 13 gigabyte scalar volume data set. I realize that's not huge, but it's actually impressive if you consider the fact that this is running over the wireless you're checking your email on right now. So we can do something like that. We can also look at, this is 600 gigabytes of microscopy images that I'm just accessing. And of course, as it comes in, it's coarse to fine. But I think it's kind of neat. There's no pre-caching on the server, nothing. It's just the data layout that is giving the interactivity here. And all the plugin's doing is saying, how big is my screen? This is the section of data I want, and it sends that request. And due to the layout on the server side, it can be retrieved without any kind of caching. Whoops. Right, so you can run these on handheld devices, which is kind of cool. We also want to do a similar thing for large-scale simulations, where the large-scale simulation directly outputs in this IDX file format, which is the hierarchical Z-order, so that when it's on your storage devices, you never have to take the entire thing and load it onto your local analysis cluster to say, anybody who's ever tried to copy a couple terabytes of memory over a network or data over a network will tell you this is a pain in the butt. So if you can already get it in this format right off the simulations, then you're at a severe advantage. I'm actually going to skip to this next part. This is really my area of expertise, which is building other kinds of abstractions for large data. So data comes in as just a bunch of voltages, I guess, electrons, which we think of as zeros and ones, but then you can visualize and turn into pretty pictures. But really, these abstractions, you can get to very high levels of abstraction until you finally reach language, which is what we communicate in. And really, the representational power of a higher level of abstraction is significant when you consider how much data it can represent. For example, by saying tetrahedrane, it evokes a model within our minds that somehow can be represented by a bunch of numbers. But in this search for abstractions, what we really want to do is take scientific data and ask what kind of abstractions are appropriate so that we can communicate in a reasonable manner and do some real science. And this is where topology-based techniques are proving to be very useful, because you can take something like a simulated porous material and start asking, how many loops are there in this material? How many times do I have to cut it to break it into two pieces? And by using parts of the Morse-Smale complex, which is just a graph structure, you can answer these questions. Or if you want to say, here's a simulation of a flame, how many of these burning regions are there and what are their shapes? If you have some abstraction primitive that says a burning region is something that satisfies this query, then that's actually very powerful, and you can do some really non-trivial science at multiple scales. So what are topological representations? They take a continuous function and turn them into something that's very discrete. So for example, here's a nice terrain. I drew some contour lines on here just for fun. So one class of technique summarizes behavior based on connected components of contours. So this is the contour tree here. Basically, each of these segments here corresponds to that region of space where the contour doesn't change its behavior. So you could morph this contour into the next guy up there without disconnecting it and reconnecting it. So for example, in this orange region, all the contours are simple closed circles, but as soon as they hit this critical point, now they're going to start merging with the circles over there. So you have these two things. Anyway, this thing summarizes that behavior. You can have Morse-Smale complexes. These summarize the behavior of a function based on gradient flow. So cells in this a cell in the complex will contain all the integral lines that start at the same maximum, end at the same minimum, or same saddle and same maximum. This is a cellular decomposition. The nice thing here is basically we've taken something that is some continuous function in space and turned it into a graph structure with attributes. So why do we use topological analysis? We can answer complex questions and then do feature-based statistics. So we can write queries on these graph structures, say, this is what my feature is. Now, for that feature, what is the distribution of so-and-so? So it's abstract, okay. Maintain a level of generality for subsequent exploration. If I just have this graph structure, I haven't yet asked the question, what is my feature? I can still change my questions, which is very important because sometimes the scientists don't know what question they're trying to answer. For example, they will come to you and say, I want to count the bubbles in this thing. And you say, well, what's a bubble? They say, well, it's this kind of thing. And you say, oh, okay, well, here's a theory. Maybe it's a maybe it's the legs of a contour tree, for example, with certain thresholds, and then what those thresholds are. Anyway, So also it provides a large data reduction because now you can summarize large areas of space with nodes in a graph. There are robust algorithms to compute them. So these are combinatorial algorithms, and you have multi-scale representations. I'm going to skip this to a large extent, but basically topological representations also are able to view a function at multiple scales. For example, by applying cancellations, you can get rid of small perturbations and ask questions about different scales of your function. So since this is a database conference, I would try to be cute and say that the feature space described by a topological representation is really a database because you store it basically as nodes with a bunch of attributes, branches with a bunch of attributes, and really the questions scientists are going to ask are, give me all the nodes with attributes in a particular range, or this kind of thing. And this is actually what makes topology-based techniques very useful for interactive exploration, because it's much easier to answer a query on a database than to say, I'm going to solve this complex differential equation and try to grow some blob in space that matches certain parameters. So here's a practical example of what we're talking about. Here, the scientists tried to simulate, well, they did simulate a lifted flame. So this is at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And we picked the merge tree to represent this function. Then by doing certain parameter selection, so at this point, we've already encoded our data set in this tree. Then by doing parameter selection, you can basically pick subsets of this thing, start aggregating those in a certain way. So combining entries from your database, combining statistics, and so on. And you can get pretty cool analysis. Here's some examples of our interface. For example, here you would be selecting parameters, and basically these just update the queries to your database of features, and this just renders the result of your features, your queries. Our challenges in going forward right now are that scientific data is much more going in the direction of in situ computation. So they can't afford anymore to dump all their data, and therefore to do some kind of analysis, you have to do it on the same cores as they're doing their computation. However, topology is a global. Okay, I'm just going to skip through this. Basically, our problem is that we have these large supercomputers and our feature representations that we want to ask questions about live distributed on these computers. So you have basically the problem of having sparse features in some nodes, very dense in others. I'm actually going to go through this. Here's another example where we applied this to high-dimensional data, the same kind of framework. Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Any burning questions? We probably can find a minute or two. Okay, in that case, we are switching to the next speaker. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.